Well, it's good to be back with you again this week, and we had a good, as mentioned earlier on the call, had a good time together as a family last week on some vacation time, and was restful and nice to be up in the mountains. And heard that you had a good time with Tim last week. Glad he was able to step in and be a part of leading the sermon time last Sunday, and thanks to Ed as well for helping organize and facilitate that as well. So we want to jump back into our Parables of Jesus series this morning. And I just want to start with a question for you to consider, and that is, have you ever been on the receiving end of an act of extravagant love or generosity? And I think probably many of us in different times and places have been. I could share countless stories of the answer positively to this question for our own family over the years. And I just, as an example, wanted to share something that happened just more recently back at I don't know, around the the changing of the year, 2019, early 2020, something like that. But we were in this place, obviously, that we were in between ministry positions. I was in between jobs, and we were in a spot where we basically, the money that I had gotten from my last position was drying up, and it was essentially gone. And so prior to that, I had done some research on trying to find a way to I'd sent out an email to a bunch of my folks that I knew in churches and whatnot, just to kind of see, do you know of any sort of housing opportunities? Because as you probably imagine, paying rent is the biggest expense that anybody, rent or a mortgage payment tends to be sometimes the largest solo expense that you experience during the course of a month. And so I reached out and I just said, just curious to know if you know of people that have space that we could live in for a couple of months until we get things figured out, because the finances were drying up. And so I didn't get a lot of hits, but I did get a friend of mine from another church reach back out to me and said, well, we don't know of anybody that has a place for you to live, which is really what I was asking. But they said, but let me look into a couple of things and see if there's something we can do to assist in terms of as a church. And this was a previous church that I worked at. And so, long story short, I heard back from the individual, and he says, yeah, I think we'd like to pay a month's rent for you for where you are to extend your time. And so, as you can imagine, that's a significant gift. And the person mentioned one more time, he says, but I've got a few more details I'm working on, so let me get back to you. So I waited another couple of days, and then he got back to me and said, actually, I've got good news. We've decided to actually pay for 2 months of rent for you where you are. And I said, oh, wow, that's awesome. I was so incredibly thankful. And then by the time that I was about to be given the funds to pay for rent, I found out the person told me again that they decided to actually do a third month. So we basically, within the scope of about a week, went from like having nothing to kind of fall back on to having 3 months of our rent paid for, which you can imagine rent in this area is a significant gift. And it was just a great encouragement just to be able to be lifted up and supported in that way, where there was a real tangible need that we had. And I would be lying to you if I said that that's an uncommon experience. We have been on the receiving end of incredible acts of generosity that just have blown our mind in many different ways. And so we're incredibly thankful and grateful each and every time that it happens. But a lot of times I find myself not surprised, because God has just had a habit of doing amazing things and that I wasn't necessarily anticipating or even asking for. And so maybe you have a story like that, or other experiences where you've been on the receiving end of extravagant love and action of love or generosity to you. When we're on the receiving end of those kinds of acts of generosity and love, it really blows us away as people, because in a small way we're experiencing really God's actions towards us. That's what we're experiencing in those moments. It's only because God is extravagantly loving and generous that we have the ability to be extravagantly loving and generous to other people. I want you to understand that. Like, it's not because you have some great thought or some great desire to be generous to somebody that you've developed and concocted on your own in order to do that. It's that God, you being an image bearer of God, God has created in you a spirit of generosity and life that wants to be exposed and lived out. A lot of times we stand in the way of that, right? But God has wired us that way because it's a part of his image-bearing likeness within us. And so when we are able to respond extravagantly, it's because of God's creating that in us, and because of God's generosity and love towards us as people that motivates and encourages us to live that way as well. And so when we experience that generosity, we're given a taste of the kingdom of God. And when we are able to give that generosity or to express extravagant love and generosity to other people, and it's not just financial, extravagant love and generosity is a whole life experience and not just related to financial gifts. When we are able to respond in that way to other people, we make the kingdom of God known and real to others. And so this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to look at actually 3 parables, and I'm going to kind of hit these quickly, so don't think, oh man, we're going to be on the call for the next hour as you kind of go through 3 parables. That's not going to happen. But all 3 of these parables fit together, and that's why I lumped them together. And it's in Luke chapter 15. It's the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. And all 3 of these parables fit together. Jesus is trying to give us a message, teach us something by using these 3 different stories, these 3 different parables. And what we essentially see in these parables is that God goes to great lengths in order to express his love and acceptance towards us, and to show us his extravagant love, particularly to those that have lost their way in the world. So God goes to great lengths to show us his love. But they're not only just parables that express God's love for us as people, but they serve as any time that Jesus talks about parables, he's talking about God's reality towards you, but it's also a teaching reality towards the way in which Jesus is called us to engage other people. And so not only did these parables show us how much God loves us, but they're an example of the kind of love that we're called to express towards others. And so understanding the context of these parables is super important, and what was going on before Jesus starts sharing these parables. And so I wanted to share with you the first 2 verses. The first 2 verses in Luke chapter 15. You can see them on the screen there. It says here that now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And so these are easy verses to overlook because they kind of set up the context, and we kind of want to immediately jump into the parable, right? Because that's the main meat of the teaching is, what's the parable? What's Jesus saying? But the context of where Jesus is operating and what's happening is super important here. And if we look closely enough, we actually can see the whole point of Jesus' teaching in these parables in these 2 verses without even needing to look at the parables. It's actually quite interesting. I want you to put yourself in the scene here if you can. Try to imagine yourself being in this scene. Now, look, as you look at that first verse, now the tax collectors and the sinners are gathered around to hear Jesus. And so can you see that? Get a visualization in your mind what that looks like. There's tax collectors and sinners that are gathered around to see Jesus. And so who are these people, right? These are tax collectors to start off, and these are tax collectors were Jewish people who worked for the Roman government, and they collected taxes they collected Roman taxes from the Jewish people. And so the tax collectors were seen as traitors because they actually worked for the Roman government, but they were Jewish, and so it was like they were despised. Nobody liked them. And they made a living by charging more taxes than they needed to pay to Rome in order that they could support themselves. So they were seen as traitors. They sometimes were seen as greedy. And the reality too behind this is that there's probably a lot of tax collectors that probably didn't want to be tax collectors, but they chose to be tax collectors because it was the only source of kind of employment that they could get. And so they were in a state where they had, as a Jewish person, they had to actually go work for essentially their enemy, right, in order to make a living. And so you can imagine this challenge that might be for them. So that's who the tax collectors are here. There are also people that are talked about here as being sinners. And in this context, that was probably referring to adulterers and prostitutes. Probably more directly relates to people involved in some aspect of sexual sin. And so people that have messed up and they were labeled for the rest of their lives as this. They were, the people that were seen as the furthest away from God. And so remember that the religious ones were the ones that controlled the government, and they controlled things. And so these people, the tax collectors, the adulterers, the prostitutes, they were the outcasts in society. They were despised by God, at least in terms of they weren't truly despised by God, but the way that the religious leaders saw them. Okay. And so it's these people, these tax collectors and sinners gathered around Jesus that are interested in him. They're the furthest away from God, but they're desirous of learning from him. And Jesus is, can you see the image? Like Jesus is welcoming them in conversation. He's communicating value and love by spending time with them. And so these folks, we talked about the soil, the parable of the soil a few weeks back. These people are the good soil because they recognize their need and their brokenness, and their need for God's love, acceptance, and his forgiveness. And so maybe you can look and see the faces of these people with Jesus. They're probably very intrigued. They're experiencing a sense of warmth from Jesus, a sense of engagement. They know that they don't deserve to be shown love and acceptance, and yet they're being shown love and acceptance and care. Now, I want you to shift your thinking now to the second verse. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes with sinners and eats with them." So can you see them? See Jesus with the tax collectors and sinners kind of standing in one area, and then look up to your right and you can see the steps maybe leading to the temple. And you can see the Pharisees and the teachers of the law standing up there with their arms crossed, kind of, looking at each other, kind of observing with kind of a judgmental posture and muttering. It says that they mutter. They're muttering to each other. And typically muttering is something where you don't want to be anybody to hear or to kind of know outside of your circle what you're saying. But typically there's a sense of dissatisfaction or irritation that's going on. And so you might be able to see their faces with disgust and pride and irritation and judgment. Who does this guy think that he is? Who does this Jesus think that he is? Their hate and their pride is pretty obvious. It's pretty well seen here. And so it's within this context that Jesus is teaching these parables. He hears the muttering and he turns to address the religious leaders and the other people. What is he going to say to them? And what Jesus is essentially communicating in these parables is that this is super important, friends, that the way of God is the way of love, and an extravagant and irrational love at that. I mean, it's the way of God is the way of love. It always is. John makes it clear that God is love, the very embodiment of love. Like God, love is not separate from God. It is completely in totality who God is. And so the way of death then is the converse of that. The way of death is and evil is hatred, is pride, is judgment, is condemnation. And so the God that we serve is a God of amazing, extravagant love. He desires for us to experience it fully and to replicate it in how we relate to and interact with other people. And this is really the way of the kingdom and the way of life in the kingdom. And we talked about this several weeks ago, and again, I won't shy away from continuing to preach a message of the extravagancy of God's love. It is so foundational to the gospel story. It is so foundational to the experience of followers of Jesus. And right now, even as you heard Gene mention, it's so easy for us in culture and society today, because of so many voices out there, so many situations going on in life, to become polarized in all kinds of viewpoints, and to try to maintain control, or to be angry and hateful towards somebody because they operate or do something that we don't like, and when we see lots of anger and hatred in the world today. It's all over the place, and yet Jesus calls us to the way of love, which is a higher road. It's a way of operation that is universal. it's a way in which I didn't actually get a chance to see it. I was driving by the street down Kirtner the other day, and I saw a sign on the lawn, and I couldn't read the whole sign on the lawn, but different people are posting signs and stuff on their yards and stuff during this season, whether it's political or whatever. But this sign, the first kind of several lines that I could see from driving was this concept of this house is kind of like this idea of we choose the way of love in this season. And I don't know what all the other details were in that sign, but it triggered in me, like, that's how we as followers of Jesus need to be looking at the world today. Like, we choose the way of love in a way of complexity and a way of anger and frustration and hatred and turmoil and strife and angst. Jesus has a message for us, and it is the message of choosing his way of extravagant love in all situations and with all people, no matter what, at all times. That is what we're called to. And that is where life is found. Even the great Dr. Martin Luther King, he had that quote that, you can't combat anger and hate with anger and hate, something along those lines. It's only love can do those things. Only the extravagant love of God is able to conquer the divisiveness and the brokenness of hate and bitterness and anger in our world. And so he was on to something really true there. He was on to the way of Jesus, that we're called to love in these extravagant ways. And that's what these parables teach us. And so let me just, for a few moments, look at these with you this morning. And so if you look at the first two actually come together. And let me go back to sharing the screen here on this on these verses here. So look here, the first two this is the lost sheep and the lost coin. And so Jesus tells them this parable. He says, suppose you have 100 sheep and you loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on its shoulders and goes home. And then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I found my lost sheep. I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. And then he goes on and he goes into the second parable. He says, or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I found my lost coin. In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. And so Jesus basically uses these great parables. I mean, you think about it in this context, like he uses common analogies of the day. Like the sheep are really valuable to the shepherd. Not just because he cares for the sheep, but that sheep is some sort of generating force of income for him as well. And the woman that has the 10 silver coins, like that's probably her whole retirement package right there, right? And so she's lost one of them, which is like, I don't know, let's say maybe a whole year's worth of wages in retirement. I mean, you probably would do the same thing, right? If you had 10 years of retirement saved up and you lost a year of it, because you misplaced, I don't know, a certificate that gets you access to it, you would probably turn your house upside down to find that, right? And so he uses these analogies to talk about how, as people, we will go to great lengths to find the things that are important to us, that are valuable to us. And so Jesus uses this analogy, uses this parable to really say, that's how God sees you. Like that's how God sees you incredibly valuable. He does not have has no desire to lose one of you. He has no desire to just say, well, you know what, that one sheep, they're getting what they deserve. They shouldn't have wandered off in the first place. So let the wolves get that sheep. I'm not going to expose the other 99 to harm. But no, he relentlessly, like he pursues. He shows value by the sense that he would leave the 99 in open country and go and pursue the lost one. Like that's the extravagant love of God, the extravagant nature of God's love, that in many ways it can seem irresponsible. It doesn't make sense. And that's what extravagant love does. It's not responsible. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit the norms of how you're supposed to operate. But it's the way God operates. It's what God does. He says in Psalm 103, verses 10 and 11, look at this verse. Great verse that illustrates this. He says, He does not treat us as our sins deserve or repay us according to our iniquities. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his love for those who fear him. We are not treated as we are supposed to. Like we are deserving of being subject to massive amounts of judgment because of our sin and our separation from God and the ways in which we've turned away from God and our, like even Gene mentioned earlier, as our thoughts lead us down the wrong path. Like we are deserving of having consequences because of the ways in which we have turned against God and kind of done things selfishly according to our own way. And yet Jesus just says he doesn't treat us in the ways that we deserve. But instead, he actually disproportionately treats us with extravagancy instead, with extravagant love and extravagant generosity. And so let's look at this I want to look at the last parable here with you before we wrap up this morning. So look with me. I'm not going to have this one on the screen because it's too much text. But if you look at Luke, if you have your Bibles and you're at Luke 15, looking at verse 11, I'm going to start there. And I just want to kind of quickly go through this parable and make a couple of comments. So he continues this idea of communicating the extravagant love and generosity of God towards others. It says in verse 11, Jesus continued, and there was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger one said to his father, give me my share of the estate. And so he divided his property between them. So again, notice the picture here. Here's the demanding nature of the younger son. It was really a sign of disrespect to do what he did to his father. He demanded that he get what he felt was due him. He had a sense of entitlement, which was motivated out of selfishness and a worship of his own desires. And yet notice the father's response. The father grants the request. The father lovingly gives what the son is at because the father desperately loves the son. And so he goes to just stupid lengths to show that love to his son. He gives the son what he asks, even though he knows it's going to destroy him. He gives because it's bred out of his life. He's a giving and generous God, as the parable kind of communicates. Verse 13, not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. And after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. And so he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. So the younger son here blows all the money he was given. He's lost it in an attempt to please himself. There's this famine. He becomes to be in need. He takes this job with the pigs that is unclean and is despicable, and he's starving, and the pigs are even in better shape than he is. So we don't grasp the nature of this story in our context the way that the people that were listening to this in real time would have understood it, the Jewish people. The message to them would have been clear because this man, this younger son that left was clearly, and the way that Jesus paints the story, is clearly forgotten and despised by God. And that can be understood clearly by the use of the language of swine, of pigs. Because pigs were the lowest of the low. They were so low that in Jewish culture, you wouldn't eat pork because it made you defiled. And so here it says that the son is even worse off than this despicable, horrible creature in Jewish mentality. We a lot of times love pigs today, carnitas and hot dogs and all that stuff. We don't have, a lot of times, some of you probably hate that pork. I don't know. But we don't carry the same cultural significance related to food and that particular type of meat product as it did for the Jewish people. And so Jesus is painting this picture like this dude is in desperate need. Like he is worse than the pigs, which in their minds, they're thinking that means that he is completely despised by God. He's completely unclean. He is worthless. He's completely without hope. And so then it goes on in verse 17. And it says, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? Yet I'm here starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and he went to his father. He says, man, at least I still have a father. Perhaps he'll take me back as a slave. Definitely he's not thinking of any sort of asserting any sort of right as a son of his father. He's blown that opportunity in his mind. He's disgraced his father. But he knows the character of his father. And he says, perhaps my dad is such a loving man, perhaps he'll take me back as a slave and I could work for him and at least not be starving and worse off than the pigs. And it goes on, second part of verse 20 says, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. I mean, this is the apex, the defining moment of the story. The father, I don't know if you catch this, but the father saw him. It carries this understanding that the father is waiting for the son to come home. The father is watching for him. And he's filled with this extreme love and compassion when he sees him return. And he runs to his son and he embraces him and he kisses him. He does everything in his power to take the action towards his son when he sees his son approaching the home. He gives this extravagant love and acceptance regardless of the circumstance. And so the son is being embraced and smothered by his father, right? You get this picture. He's super uncomfortable, probably, because he's like, why is he doing this? Like, get away, or why are you doing this, Dad? Like, this isn't warranted. I mean, I totally let you down. And the son says in verse 21, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And so the son has this planned response. I got to tell my dad I'm not worthy. I'm hoping that he maybe takes me back as a son, as a slave. But the father, it's like the father doesn't even listen. Like the point wasn't the son acknowledging his lack of worthiness. The point of the parable is to show the extravagancy of God's love, or the love of Jesus towards the son. Because the father then says quickly to his servants, he says, bring a robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For the son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And so they began to celebrate. I mean, think about this, the craziness of this story, right? The son is like, maybe he'll take me back as a slave. And within 4 hours of getting home, like they're having the biggest party for that son that they've ever had. Like the extravagancy of this, like the over the top, like that is completely irresponsible. Like that son is not worthy, that the son despised you, Dad. Like, why are you doing that? Like, and that's actually the response of the older son, right? The older son is in the field and he hears about that and he comes in and he's angry. He's ticked off. He's like, man, I've been a good son and you never did this for me. And so then it creates this question of like, well, whose sin is worse, right? Was it worse off for the son who left and went away and like totally disowned his father and like blew all of his money and did whatever he wanted with his body for how much time that was? What's the greater sin, that or the sense of like pride, right? And the sense of anger and hatred towards his brother, the sense of entitlement that I've been the good son. And so I'm certainly not going to show extravagant love and care to my brother. He disowned you, right? You see that? That's where the older son is. Both are warranting and needing the extravagant love and generosity of God in their lives. Jesus concludes, and he said to his older son, he said, we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and now he's alive again. He was lost and he's now found. Like we had to celebrate. We had to. To which I would say, no, you didn't have to. Like you didn't have to do what you did, right? I mean, a lot of us would probably say the same thing. You didn't have to do what you did. Like your son came home and you didn't even have to see him. Like you could have said, dude, get away from here. Like I disown you because of what you did. Or at the very least, you could bring him in as a hired slave and make him just one of the the other slaves that you're that are enslaved in your kingdom and that they don't have much rights and all that stuff. He's like, well, at least make him one of those folks that are your servants. Like put him in that role. But Jesus communicates that he had to. respond this way? Why? Why did he have to? 1 John, because God is love. That's why he had to. The nature of God is extravagant, generous love all the time to all people, regardless of circumstance. And of course, that doesn't mean that we don't experience consequences. I mean, we read all the time. We know in our own lives, we experience consequences for sinful behavior. But God's love for us never wavers and is never less extravagant for us because of our choices and because of our sin. I mean, read the stories of the Old Testament prophets. We've gone through those before as well. Like, I mean, they're countlessly being like judged and they're like, you're going to loot, you're going to go into captivity, you've forsaken me, da 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 da. But there's always this message of hope. But it's like, I love you as a mother nursing their child. Like, I welcome you. Please come back to me. Like I'm here, I'm ready. I'm wanting to dump my love and my care and my compassion out upon you. And it's almost like he waits for the human heart, the human soul to stop worshiping itself, to be found in a place of the pig slop. Man, life sucks for me right now. Like it's really bad. Like that's where and when people come to that awareness, that's an example again to the soil. They're good soil. There's a sense of like my heart is open and pliable to God. And it's almost like God invades that. Like the minute that the heart has relinquished control of self and have said, I need God and I can't do it on my own. It's like God rushes in that moment and completely devours the person. It's a powerful, powerful. His love never changes, whether you're selfish or you're completely surrendered. His extravagant love is the same, but we become much more aware of that extravagancy and God's desire to reach us when we come to our lowest places. And so these parables, as we close this morning, these parables show us the amazing, extravagant love of God. And the great lengths that God will go to in order to express that love and acceptance towards us. Goes to great lengths. And particularly the lengths he goes towards those who have lost their way in this world. These parables also serve as a teaching example. Not only for us to embrace, as I said at the beginning, not only for us to embrace how deep God's love is for us as people. But friends, they're an example of the kind of love that we are called to express towards others as we're influenced by the kingdom life of Jesus, right? It's so important we understand that. God's love that is freely given to us is never intended for us to completely contain it and absorb it on our own. God is a reproducible the nature of God is that what God does in our life, he intends for us to reproduce or to repackage or to re-express in order to bless others. God has always operated that way. As I bless you, you're called to be a blessing. It started way back in the Abrahamic promise in the covenant. As I bless you, you're called to be a blessing to others. So there's just this sense that as God gives us his extravagant love, as we're aware of that, as we live in that, we are desiring God to transform us with that in a way that allows us to live and express that. And so I would encourage you this week. I think the message here is clear in terms of the parables, the extravagancy of God's love, but I want to encourage you to just challenge you this week to continually keep your heart and your mind in a place of asking the question, what does God's love for me call me to do for others? What does God's extravagant love towards me call me to do towards others or for others? How can you and I model that kind of love towards others? And again, when we model and express love, it's not just for the freeing nature of that for us, because to love freely is to experience freedom in our own hearts and lives. Again, it's an image-bearing thing of God. So it not only frees us to love without strings attached, whatever that looks like, but also obviously people are blessed and benefit by the extravagancy of our love. No strings attached. And so be paying attention to when you find yourself gravitating. I can tell you it's real easy for me. Anytime I open Facebook, I can find myself so easy by reading posts to easily gravitate towards an opinion or an idea. And all you have to do is read a couple of comments, and immediately you can start to form opinions or ideas. Do I agree with that? Do I not agree with that? And it's crazy how so quickly we can become less focused on embodying the life of love that Jesus has called us to, and more focused on maybe judging people that we read and what their statements are, what they think about a situation, which only can breed control and hatred and anger in our own hearts. So check yourselves. I think Gene referred to that as well earlier too. It's like, pay attention to where your heart is leading you this week, and whatever that may be. And when you notice that a sense of control is coming up, or a sense of wanting to alienate yourself from other people, or to be right, or to be, if you're angry or feel hostile towards an opinion or what somebody said to you or whatever, ask the Spirit to help you find pause in those places and say, Jesus, would you give me not only a greater awareness of your great extravagant love for me, but would you give me the courage, the strength, the ability to walk and live in freedom, and to be able to love the way that you love, to care for people the way you care for people, to not get caught up in all of the backbiting and the fighting and the arguments and the hostility, and because there's plenty of that to go around. If you want to get involved in that, just watch the news, read Facebook, whatever. We've all got our sources, right? We can easily fall into all of that stuff. But Jesus calls us to the way of love and care and extravagancy, not only for the healing nature that it brings for us as people, but for the ways in which others experience life because of it.